Our comment now will be delivered by Lauren James. Lauren James is an assistant professor of history at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. She was recently named Hope's Towsley Research Scholar for 2016. And her first book, Colonial Food in Interwar Paris, The Taste of Empire, is forthcoming with Bloomsbury Academic Press in early 2016. Lauren.
Okay, well, thank you to all three of the panelists for these really intriguing papers. Oh, this is magnetic. Which all delve into this question of what defines something as foreign and what defines something as French when it comes to food, and get in really interesting ways to the political meanings of these food choices. I'm going to keep my comments really short because I want to hear, want all of us to be able to be in conversation. And I'm going to focus predominantly on the themes of erasure and redefinition that I think unite all three of these papers. Bin Poole very insightfully prompts us to think about couscous not merely as a symbol of Algerian identity, but as a contested symbol of both otherness and inclusion. Bin points out the irony that even in offering up couscous as a symbol of Republican inclusion, that still left couscous as a use as a symbol of otherness, right? So to be used as a symbol of inclusion, it must first be a symbol of otherness to be brought in. I was most intrigued by Bin's analysis of how the narratives of authentic couscous erase the period of French Algeria, both from Algerian history and from French history. Couscous is portrayed as authentic, which in this case seems to mean unshaped by European interference, and therefore decidedly foreign. Of Bin's examples, only the Pied Noir singer includes French Algeria as part of French history and identity. And Bin correctly points out that industrially produced couscous, eaten in much of the world today, was a development of colonial history, and that most narratives of couscous strive to erase this reality. I wonder if there's kind of another element about sort of grain and how it's produced today that might be an interesting factor or way to think about this here. From an Algerian perspective, what role does colonial history play in the articulation of meaning around couscous? So today, Algeria is one of the top 5 importers of grain in the world, and the vast majority of the grain it imports, at least 80%, comes from France. The wheat they import is mostly soft wheat that's milled for bread flour, and less of it is the hard wheat that's used to produce semolina flour that makes couscous. That's mostly indigenously produced in Algeria. And so I wonder if this difference of the type of grain used to make bread or flour, used to make bread or couscous and where this grain comes from, might somehow impact the idea of couscous as a national Algerian dish, and sort of, I don't know how that's articulated in Algeria. And then I'm also curious whether for Algerians in France, for Franco-Algerians, if there's sort of identification of different brands that are seen as more Algerian or French when purchasing either these canned couscous dishes, or probably more importantly, the sort of instant couscous that's used to make the dish at home. Erica Peters, focusing especially on changing names given to pho or soup tonkinoise or soup nationale, also shows how a dish can be associated with different histories by different groups consuming that dish. Pho developed in a specifically colonial context, and the historical erasure here is usually not the memory of French colonialism, but the role of the Vietnamese in the creation of their own food. I was especially interested here in the question of naming the dish, and I wonder if in future study an expanded pool of sources might lead to sort of an even more complex story. Here, Erica uses mostly restaurant reviews and cookbooks to trace the name of the dish and how it changed over time, and novels, which I thought was a really interesting way of looking at it. And I wonder what a survey of contemporary sort of foodie blogs or discussions of people who dine out online might reveal about how pho is referred to now and by different groups of eaters and diners. I also wonder, and these sources may not be readily available, if you could compare menus from different restaurants over time, or comparison of menus today, how the dish is named by different producers and sellers of the dish for different audiences. I think Leora Auslander's paper also points to a historical erasure. In this case, the current hot political debate around school lunches and their accommodation or lack of accommodation of religious and other dietary restrictions ignores the recent history of mutual compromise and quiet accommodation in many French towns. I wonder what role the other recent political flare-ups around halal meat might play in the current school lunch controversy. First, the debates in 2009 when Le Quick introduced halal menus in some of its burger restaurants, and then the 2012 outrage on the right about halal meat coming from Ile-de-France slaughterhouses that was often not labeled as halal. Do these other halal debates in the political press put the school lunch issue on the political agenda in a new way that it wasn't before? Leora's paper is also insightful on the question of the national versus regional control of school lunches. In some sense, the local control is tempered by a sort of national agenda to teach French national identity through food, even as this national culinary identity is composed of regional variations. The former colonies, however, were never included in these regions of French culinary identity. I wonder if pork, or in some cases maybe some other meats in particular, are in some ways defended by some precisely because of the role they play in dishes that are seen as particularly regional and part of a local identity within French national cuisine. I'm most intrigued by Leora's concluding assertion that a certain empathy about dietary restrictions may be part of what accounts for many French people opposing the Muslim headscarf in schools while being willing to accommodate a pork-free or vegetarian lunch. This idea relies on the understanding that our concept of what is edible to us is, yes, acquired through our upbringing in families and cultures, but it's then very visceral and embodied and something that we aren't seen as being able to control. What to wear seems to many French a pure choice. What one eats is somewhat understood as a response to this embodied experience as what is edible or inedible, what is appetizing or not appetizing. Disgust, the visceral, emotional response that's shaped by culture, plays a real role here. To reject a food as disgusting or inedible does not seem to some to be a choice. And therefore, Leora argues, there is a sort of empathy for the rejection of meat or rejection of specific meats. I'm so intrigued by this because in my own work, I focused a lot on how this embodied, visceral understanding of what's appropriate for me to eat versus what's appropriate for you to eat has been seen as a marker of racial identity in the early 20th century in France. So there are some foods that are appropriate for the French, some foods that are appropriate for the Vietnamese, for West Africans, etc. Hence, the importance of the efforts of many French colonizers to eat French foods while in the colonies. So this idea that even while divided by diet, and sort of an embodied and maybe racial meaning to that division by diet, that also then could reveal, in today's society, an empathy for the dietary preferences of others is just kind of a really intriguing flip of how I've thought about this before. So I'm intrigued for kind of be a new thing for us in food history to think about. We see in all of these papers the importance of foods as symbols, but I want to kind of take this point to emphasize the possibility of kind of understanding food not just as symbol, but as something that's used kind of differently as a more complex symbol because of this very embodied, visceral part that it plays in all of our lives. Thanks.
All right, so thank you so much, Lauren. I'm going to now open it up to questions from the audience because we only have about we're almost 15 minutes left. And I'll just start by saying I thought the papers were fantastic and went really well together, as Lauren illustrated.
Hold on for a second. Really great papers. I enjoyed them all. I have a question for Leora. From my own experience in France with my family, I'm always dealing with problems of food allergies. And I wondered what happens to French school children with allergies. Do they have to eat somewhere else, or accommodations made for them to eat in the lunchroom? And if they are, is there a parallel there that people were bringing up when they were discussing food practices in schools?
There are, as far as I know, actually one thing that's interesting, empirically far fewer food allergies in France than there are, and that's generally true in Europe, than there are in the United States, which is a whole interesting thing in itself. And there is no accommodation. That is, it follows the same, that they too have to deal with it the way they would, the same way other restrictions do, or, pick and choose among the food that's offered. But there's no option.
I found all the papers fascinating. I know I'll be thinking about them all for a long time. I have a specific question for Erica Peters. In your history of the pho, you started out by saying that it dated from the early 20th century, and then I was riveted when the first date you actually gave was from 1919. And I wonder if the First World War plays a part in this history at all, or if that's just a wild coincidence.
The First World War plays a part in moving soldiers around, but I don't think he was there for that reason. I haven't thought about that. Obviously, I should have writing the date 1919 and repeating it should have bounced in my head. Radicalism in Vietnam is probably related to them coming back from France, where they had new ideas. And a lot of Vietnamese went to France for the war effort and then came back, whether they were working in factories or working as soldiers. So there's certainly a narrative among the French that World War I radicalized the Vietnamese. But I want to look more into the author, that specific author, and what his trajectory was before I give you a solid answer. Thank you, that's a good question.
I have a question for Leora. I read a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, that there was a new national mandate for what would be in school lunches through the Ministry of Education that was such that it seemed to preclude vegetarian dishes. And so there was a protest of vegetarians, which is a long-suffering vegetarian in France. I felt like it must have been all the vegetarians there. There were 500 people outside of the Ministry of Education. And in the coverage of that, I don't remember seeing that linked to the issue of sort of a vegetarian alternative to providing kosher or halal food. Or I didn't also think about it because I didn't know how municipal these choices were as sort of like a national projection of sort of backdoor precluding these local options. So I was wondering if you know more about what came of that and if activists for halal or kosher food were involved in that protest or how that actually ended up playing out on the ground. I think that was maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, so it was, the proposal died at the time, but Diego is it's now, that was a proposal, that wasn't a proposal for mandated, right? That was a proposal for schools to offer.
I think it was. I think the issue was that the amount of protein in the meal
Yes.
that they were
Yeah.
legislating would have precluded any kind of vegetarian.
Yes, there was that discussion. I think it died on the grounds. It's now the texts are coming back to me. It died on the grounds of the insufficient protein provision. There's been reference made back to it now that the new law is on the table, with data gathered to indicate how you can get. It's not a problem to in fact gather enough protein in a vegetarian diet, and gathering also evidence about the healthiness of a vegetarian diet. There's also the suggestion that it died last time not because of the protein question, but because it was in fact associated with the religious question. And so that was why there was refusal last time, and that's the terms in which it's being debated. The two terms on which it's being debated now are, accommodation to religious, and some will actually say theological difference, and the other is local right, is intrusion of the national state where it doesn't belong. So, and it will be, but this go around is going to have more legs. I don't know if it's going to pass, but it's clear that the position has been shifting, and part of why I do find this so interesting is that it is the fluidity on this question, while the headscarf question is rigidifying.
I'm thinking about the difference between the headscarf and the diet, and my immediate intuition is that headscarves are, of course, quote-unquote ostentatious symbols. They are public. They are things that have a perceptual impact on people other than the wearer. In fact, the wearer can't see most of her headscarf unless she looks in the mirror. And so I'm relating that to the other two papers and thinking about whether couscous and pho are something that one consumes chiefly in restaurants. So again, you're going out into another space that is marked as not the domestic. It's not fully sort of integrating or, sort of making it, it is making it part of your body but not part of your home. And so the difference between sort of the public and the private registers in all three papers, I thought it might be interesting to explore.
Couscous, I think, is interesting in that it has, I think, unlike other quote-unquote foreign foods in France, has sort of breached that divide and is eaten in homes and is eaten in school cafeterias as well, and is eaten in places other than restaurants now, as we saw with the canned couscous, for instance, which is,
Who eats that?
it's interesting.
Sorry.
It's interesting to somebody is eating it because there's tons of it when you walk down the aisle in the supermarket in France. It's not that great. Why it has become so popular, I think, is interesting. I mean, I don't think that the sort of political implications that I talked about are necessarily the reason why it's become popular. I think that it, it's kind of a convenient, that makes it a kind of convenient sort of political symbol. But so why it has actually made its way into French homes and into schools and things like that is perhaps not something I can answer concretely.
I think, so pho is not eaten in the home, but rice is now much more than it was a generation ago, and I think that's sort of, I would say that there is a move in the people in their 20s, or in their 20s when I was doing research, which is a while ago now, in their 30s now, to want to feel part of a global world, and so they don't think of it as colonial foods necessarily, but as they're eating foods that their parents wouldn't have eaten. And rice is now conveniently available in little sachets that with instructions on how to make it so you won't ruin it like your parents did. So I do think that a modern, a vision of the world with themselves in it as very modern and not like their parents includes couscous and rice at home as being, we're so convenient, I mean, we use convenient products. Now, I haven't been back to do more research since there's been, localism and a rejection of industrial food in that way. So it may now be changing again. I'm not sure. But I would wonder whether canned couscous has went up and then down again in its sales.
Yeah, it seems very. That particular portion of my research hasn't made its way all the way up to the present, so I couldn't necessarily comment on that. But it seems a little bit dated in a way, the kind of vote for any sort of canned, kind of complete meal in a can seems sort of very. So we move beyond that. Right. Right.
I like that something really quickly. At least from looking at a whole bunch of, because school cafeteria menus are online. And there isn't a lot of so that's and there are far more instances of couscous as grain without the rest of the couscous. That is without the dish. So it's like rice or potatoes or noodles. So it has entered more into the starch category, but not into the dish, not accompanied by what one would normally imagine couscous accompanied by.
That's probably true in the home as well. When they make it, they'll probably make it with their own way, with whatever else they would have eaten, noodles or.
Yeah.
So I think everyone tends to think of it as a whole.
Yeah, I think it is sort of symbolically, at least the way I was talking about today, it's still seen as this kind of distinct, sort of defined dish. But there has definitely also been some marketing efforts to suggest that couscous can be used in the way that rice is used, the way that pasta is used, as sort of a variety of uses.
Tamara, and then we've got 2 more questions.
Yeah, I'd also like to just say what a completely fabulous panel this was and how well all of the papers went together. And I was especially interested actually in your comment about the import of flour sort of into Algeria. And I was wondering, Ben, when you talk about the way in which it's French industries who are responsible for producing couscous in the first place, was that for export? Do you know, was that for export or was that for an internal market? And also, just as you think about revising this for publication, and it was so great to get to see you do this because he was my student. Fabulous, I really appreciate it. But as you think about revising it for publication, I really think it would be great to think about the comments that were made here in terms of that sort of, because I know globalization, transnationalism is such a big focus inside of the dissertation as a whole. That was just a really important point. But yeah, but the question of, was it made for export, was it made for internal?
Right. I think that the sort of development of couscous production, quote unquote, industrially was a gradual process. As one of my pictures was kind of a workshop really with a handful of people kind of working together to make couscous originally, and I think that developed over time into the sort of big factories that exist now. So I think that at the time it was mainly produced for consumption in North Africa, and presumably mainly in Algeria. And because the sort of consumption of it in France has been really is much later. And I believe that with decolonization, those companies moved then to France, and so the production of the industrial production of couscous is now happening in France by companies that were originally founded in colonial Algeria. So does that kind of answer the question? Yeah.
Great. I think with apologies, I think we have time for just 1 more question.
This is going to be too spectacularly broad, but during Ben and Erica's talk, I was wondering if there's something, what's particularly French about the desire to locate authenticity and timelessness in food. And I was kind of wondering, is there something about French food culture or foodways in the longue durée that informed that desire in the French as colonizers, or whether it was the French colonial project that kind of retrospectively or retroactively made it more urgent to locate authenticity in food and food practice?
I'm not persuaded that it's more French than, I mean, it's an interesting question to look into, but I'm not going to speculate about what makes it so French to do that when I don't necessarily think that other countries don't see food as viscerally eternal and authentic. I don't have a very good answer, but I'm nervous about the premise.
My take on it would be all of the above in terms of the different theories that you put forward there. But I think, to me, at least, sort of my argument is that this need to sort of define authenticity and localize food as very sort of rooted traditions in a particular place, and of course, the idea of terroir goes back a long ways, but the popularity of that idea and the explosion of that idea has been fairly recent, in my opinion, and I think it has something to do with early globalization, and it's almost trying to find, anchor points within a world that's perhaps even more sort of fluid and globalizing. So,
Much better. All right, I think at that point, it's a touch past 10, so I'm going to have to end the session. Let's give it a wonderful applause.